Welcome to Reliability Matters, a podcast for the electronic assembly industry. Each episode covers topics related to reliability, best practices, and environmentally responsible assembly techniques, with insights from experts across the electronic assembly industry. Now, here's your host, Mike Conrad.
Welcome back to yet another episode of the Reliability Matters podcast. I really appreciate you being here today. And thank you all for your wonderful support. We're approaching 15,000 downloads. I celebrated when we hit 100, so you can imagine how I feel with coming up on 15,000. I really appreciate your support. Thank you also for all of your comments and feedback and episode suggestions. Sometimes when you sit in front of a camera, you don't see anything back. I don't see you. So it's really nice to know that you're out there and through your downloads of episodes and through your feedback to me. I really appreciate it. Let's talk about solder paste, shall we? We haven't talked about solder paste in a little bit. We've talked about it a couple times over the last few years, but I'm hearing a lot of buzzwords. I'm hearing all about high reliability solder paste, which makes me wonder what's the regular solder paste about. I'm hearing a lot of talk about low temperature and ultra low temperature solder paste. I'd like to know more about that. And I have some technical questions about that. So the best way to answer those questions is to bring in an expert. So my guest today is Paul Salerno. He holds an MBA with a specialization in finance and marketing from Rutgers Graduate School of Business. He's a global portfolio manager at MacDermid Alpha Electronic Solutions with an expertise in product lifecycle management and development of strategic technology roadmaps. We're going to ask him about the roadmap in a little bit. He is the global surface mount, roadmaps for global surface mount technology business. Paul works with customers in both Europe and Asia and in the automotive, computing, communications, consumer electronics markets, and a lot of that. Sounds like he has a lot on his plate. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for being my guest today. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I understand, and when I did some research, I saw an interview you did not too long ago. I think it was earlier this year. And also on your bio that you are focused on a technology roadmap, which is interesting. I always like to look into the future, right? And see what direction we're going. And so tell me a little bit about what that technology roadmap is all about relative to your business, and what are you doing within the world of that roadmap?
Yeah, sure. So, I think ultimately, right, it's nothing unlike most organizations out there, which do have technical expertise and commercially familiar folks who focus on really the strategic long-term planning of our technology, right? So understanding where we're going, where the electronics assembly industry is going, and where we need to stay competitive. So I think when you look at it from a very holistic view, my focus is in strategic long-term planning, as well as the product lifecycle management side, where you need to have products that meet both today's needs but prepare you for the future needs. So addressing existing challenges as well as future challenges is kind of the approach that you take when you develop a good technology roadmap for your organization.
So there are several different species, for lack of a better term, species of alloys or solder paste, fluxes, types, alloy constituents, things like that. Do certain industries gravitate toward one specific description or type or species of solder paste? So do the automotive folks have a different requirement than the space folks and the aerospace folks and the commercial folks, downhole, harsh environment, safe environment? Are there different market segments that gravitate to different products, or is it kind of all the same and they all have their favorites, but they're all kind of the same?
Yeah, no, that's actually a great question and a great point. So many people assume high reliability translates to exposure to, say, a high temperature environment or a traditional high reliability market segment like automotive or defense or aero, where products like the Inalot solder alloy are widely adopted for applications where operating temperatures are above maybe 120 Celsius and beyond. But you also still need to think about other market segments where reliability is defined in a different way, such as in the low temperature space, where HRL, our products such as HRL series alloys, where you combine a traditional tin bismuth based alloy with microalloying additions to improve reliability for applications that are even below 100 Celsius. So it really is predicated a lot on the market segment and the solution for that given customer's application.
That makes a lot of sense. Components are getting increasingly smaller, which is great for me because we're in the cleaning business. So the smaller components get, the closer to the board they are, the closer they are to each other, the less residue that is tolerable on the assembly, and the more likelihood someone's going to clean. That separate with components, so that allows, that's an opportunity for business for anyone in the cleaning industry. For your industry, as components are getting increasingly smaller and closer together, and the pitch is almost non-existent anymore. I mean, it's practically, you couldn't put a human hair between component pads now. How has that affected the solder paste industry? I know the cleaning industry has certainly affected it. It's more business, but it's also difficult to clean these types of residues. So in your industry, how has miniaturization landed in your world?
Yeah, no, so when we think of high reliability, there's certainly the thermomechanical side of it, which is driven primarily by the solder alloy. But then there's the other side of reliability, which comes into play with the solder flux chemistry, and that's electrochemical reliability. So, by design, a solder flux is supposed to be corrosive, in the sense that it's supposed to clean and prepare the surface that it's going to be soldering for soldering. And so as we see these smaller, more densely designed packages and board designs, electrochemical reliability becomes more and more paramount. So designing a flux chemistry that's capable of withstanding the requirements of a finer pitched VGA component, or even covered components like bottom terminated components, where you have large areas of solder paste confined into a very small, tight space, electrochemical reliability becomes paramount. And so we've certainly had to rethink how you design chemistries for finer pitched applications.
I was going to ask you this a little bit later in this conversation, but you mentioned BTC, so it's a pretty good segue. It used to be, probably a couple years ago, it seemed all we talked about on the show was voiding. That was the poster child of technical conversations. And 30% voiding's okay. No, you can actually have 50%. I had someone tell me you can have 70% voiding. It's probably fine. Probably fine doesn't really sell machines, but I get the context of it. Is voiding, so 2020, or is it still a relevant topic of conversation today? Is it still a concern? Is it still being chased by companies like yours to reduce it even further?
Yep. Yeah. No, voiding is, if I had to pick top 5 conversations I have every single day,
it's still out there.
It's certainly there. Yeah. Voiding is paramount. The reasons behind that and the philosophical reasons behind that, we can debate that. But ultimately, our customers are driving us to lower voiding and reducing voiding levels. If we just think about it from a very basic, simple-minded perspective, which is kind of how I think of things, you look at if you envision what a solder void looks like to the average person, looks like an area where you have an air gap, preventing a electrical contact, right? So you have an insulative type property in air, and you have a conductive metal in the areas where you don't have voiding. So in theory, right, lower voiding translates to better thermal management. But I don't believe, and I think the industry in itself has kind of come to the conclusion that that number can vary, right? And there really isn't an exact science as to what the target voiding levels should be. What I can tell you is that most of our customers would love zero voiding every day. And as a solder paste supplier, we focus a lot of our energy on mechanisms and ways that we can help reduce voiding. And some of it's in chemistry design, and some of it is in process design. And we work with our customers every day on helping to optimize voiding for their application. Yeah,
it's funny, when people are concerned about voiding, they're normally concerned, at least from my vantage point, of the intermetallic bond. They don't want the parts to fall off under a stress condition. They're concerned about heat dissipation. They're concerned about electrical conductivity. What a lot of people don't realize is there's another concern. If you have too much voiding, you got a lot of residue under that part. Because people think of a void as an absence of anything, and it is not a absence of anything. It's not a vacuum in that gap. It's usually flux residues. That's usually what's causing the void. That and air not being able to escape. But typically, if you were to pull a component off that has large voids on it, you'll find residue in those voids. And now, in many cases, it's benign because it's not spanning two conductors, right? So, other than maybe the chance of corrosion or something, you're not going to get an ECM event from that. But it could outgas out and migrate out and be problematic. So, from a voiding standpoint, from a contamination standpoint, the lower the voiding, the less entrapped volatiles underneath the component. From an ECM perspective, that's also a reason to keep the debate alive. I guess it's not going away anytime soon.
Definitely. And it's funny. One of the solutions that we'll work with customers who just require such low voiding is to use a solder preform. And because when you think about a solder paste, right, it's 50% metal alloy by volume, 50% flux. So if you can reduce the flux, which is the volatile outgassing generating the voiding during the reflow process, you can reduce that by using things like a solder preform, then that's an option for you. And it just depends on how important that is for you and what you're willing to add to your SMT process.
Yeah. How do harsh environments affect solder paste selection process? And the reason I ask that is with Internet of Things, IoT, we're putting a lot of stuff out there that, we're putting electronics in things that have historically never had electronics in them. And then we're taking those things, as a wearable or in a car or, somewhere in the real world, the real harsh world. If I'm going to put something outside in a smart meter, for example, like electrical meter, or on a wearable or in a car, am I going to think differently about my solder paste selection than if something's going to live in an Amazon server farm?
Yeah, absolutely. You should, right? When the automotive industry is certainly one of the leaders in this space in investigating what a saturated environment could do to a solder flux or solder paste residue. And so what we do is quite often we'll work with our customers to assess our chemistries for reliability, electrochemical reliability in harsh environments that include high temperature, high humidity environments. Because if you think about it from the standpoint of, like you said, a server farm, which is a very controlled environment, versus an automobile where you have this exposure to moisture from the air. So when we do what is considered an automotive damp heat test, right? You actually create a saturated environment for moisture to embed itself on the circuit board and assess the electrochemical performance. Because when you have a corrosive flux residue in combination with a fine pitch or fine spaced PCB design, in combination with moisture, you create an optimal scenario for electromigration. So, making sure that you are accounting for the effect of high humidity environments that are non-controlled is becoming incredibly important in the automotive industry and beyond, even the consumer space.
Excellent. So not too long ago, I watched a video of another solder materials manufacturer talk about their products, and it was a spin on a product I'd never really heard before. They were talking about how cleanable their no-clean solder paste was. And now all no-clean solder paste is cleanable. In fact, in terms of the number one type of flux that's being removed today, it's no-clean. And that's not because everyone is removing no-cleans. That's just because pretty much everyone is using no-cleans. And those that have to clean are cleaning no-cleans, which just makes a lot of logical sense to me. Now, I've never really heard of a manufacturer promote a no-clean product that's easy to clean. Usually, if you want something easy to clean, go to an OA or something like that. Without giving away specifics, because what they said may be entirely accurate, or it might just be a spin on a from their marketing department. I don't know, but are there no clean fluxes that are designed to be more easily cleaned, or are they all? Do they all share the same? They can be a little bit difficult to clean. My experience is they're usually on the more difficult side to clean. Very, very cleanable, but they're on the more difficult side because they have such low solids content, and they rely on an oven profile being pretty accurate, so you don't volatilize and polymerize the materials too soon in the process, and that becomes a little bit more difficult to clean. So from your perspective, long question, I realize, but from your perspective, are certain no cleans more easily cleaned than others, or are they? Is that something that you guys even think about when you're formulating a no clean or not?
Yeah, right. It depends on it depends on the application, certainly, but I would say overall, right, it's a bit of a loaded question. No clean solder pastes are designed to be, no clean, right? So the corrosive residue is designed specifically to be encapsulated post reflow to prevent things like electromigration, right? I think for high volume users, which is the most of the industry, adding a cleaning step typically is outweighed by the benefits of using a no clean option. Certainly you can look to water soluble chemistries as an option, but the downside of that obviously is you have these highly active post reflow residues that you don't really have the luxury of waiting for extended periods of time. So I think in principle, the idea makes a lot of sense, where you can achieve the ability to use a product as a no clean or to clean it when you feel that it's necessary. But I think the other approach of it is to design chemistries, which is what primarily what we focus on, is design chemistries to be designed for no clean applications where you achieve the electrochemical requirements of a no clean chemistry with a traditional no clean chemistry over having to use a cleaning process. So really challenging applications, moving towards or designing a chemistry that focuses on maximizing the electrochemical reliability in a no clean space is more important than a no clean that's cleanable in a lot of cases. And similarly, you can look at that from a conformal coating standpoint, where users would want to clean, and you could focus chemistry design on compatibility with no cleans. So in theory, sure, a cleanable no clean is great. And at times we do certainly assess our chemistries for that as options for customers who do need it. But is it something that we actively pursue over being able to achieve the highest electrochemical reliability with a no clean paste? Then I would say no, it's not something that we're working towards.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about the solder paste types. They're typed into type 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know how high they go. And obviously that has something to do with the sphere size, right? The powder size, as I understand it. What are the differences between these types, and what circumstances would draw someone to a type 5 versus a type 4 versus a type 6 versus a type 3?
Yeah. So powder types are like you said is basically a measure of the powder size distribution in that given powder type. So, for example, a type 4 solder paste would have powder sizes somewhere between 20 and 38 microns. That would be the general distribution. Type 5s, somewhere in the 15 to 25 micron, and then as far out to type 7, type 8, where maybe you have powder sizes down to as low as 2 to 11 micron sizes. And I think the advantage, obviously, from the standpoint of the user, is for ultra fine feature sizes and smaller product designs, is you with finer powder types, you get the ability to fill smaller aperture sizes. It's all about how can you fill that stencil with as much solder volume as possible to get a good solder joint. And so moving towards finer powder types, your type 5, type 6, type 7, allows you to more readily achieve the volume transfer efficiency targets that you might have in your product design. Now, the disadvantage of that is you certainly need to account for that in your chemistry design, because smaller powder sizes increase the surface area for the flux chemistry to do its job, which is to clean that surface and prepare it for soldering. And so smaller powder sizes create an increased surface area, which creates challenges for the chemistry design. And we have a very specific focus towards achieving that, while balancing the electrochemical requirements of a fine feature application.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about low temperature solder and ultra low temperature solder. Sure. I understand in principle what they are. They melt at lower temperatures. They reflow. The peak temperatures can be lower. What would the reason be that one would choose a low temperature solder? Back in the old days, eutectic, 363 degrees, right? It was like 362, it was solid. 363, it was wet. Something to that effect. Now I'm hearing reflow temperatures as low as 150 C in some cases. So, what would drive people toward a low temperature solder or an ultra low temperature solder? What are the benefits, and what is not practical about that?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it really it's a kind of an interesting point in the industry's evolution when we think about the use of low temperature solder alloys. I think historically, you have your tin bismuth eutectic solder, which is solidus liquidus point is somewhere around 138 Celsius. And they've been historically plagued by factors such as brittleness, which is why they weren't widely adopted in say, most consumer type applications where drop shot could be a requirement. And so where the industry has really pushed towards is the movement towards ductile low temperature alloys, such as our HRL series, where we consider ourselves kind of a leader in this space, where you combine micro alloying additions to your traditional tin bismuth based alloys to enhance the performance. And the goal always is, how can I get reliability similar to that of SAC 305, but reflow at a lower temperature? And why would I need to do that? So the reason you would need to reflow at lower temperatures is because these component packages are increasing the die to package ratio for starters, and they're getting larger and more complex. So during the traditional SAC 305 reflow process, where you're reflowing as high as 240, 250 Celsius, you do create a volatile environment where you can have warpage of the component in the reflow process, and that creates warpage-induced defects such as non-wet opens, head and pillow, and other factors which could reduce the reliability of the solder, of the resulting product design. And so the idea of being able to reflow at lower peak reflow temperatures, thus mitigating the warpage-induced defects, has become a trend in the industry, where you need to develop high rel, low temp solder alloys for these type of applications.
Excellent. So one of the concerns I would have, maybe it's valid, maybe it's not, you can help straighten me out, with low temperature is we did a study. We're in the process of duplicating that study with an analytical laboratory, Foresight, in Kokomo, Indiana. And what the study is showing is that we took boards, test boards. I don't know if they were B52s or some type of test board with connectors and surface mount components on it. And we reflowed them using a no-clean solder paste at the recommended peak temperature limits. And this peak temperature was 250 degrees. And then we extracted contamination from under certain key points of the part and ran it through ion chromatography, determined what the contamination was, what the levels were, and the board fell into the acceptable category in terms of contamination. We found contamination, but none of it was problematic. Then we reflowed identical boards with the same material, but we lowered the peak reflow temperature by 4%, 10 degrees. So we hit 240 instead of 250, 4%. And duplicated the test, extracted the contamination, ran it through ion chromatography. We had residue increases of up to 600% in various parts of the board. Some were 150%, 200%, 300%, 600%. But pretty much all across the board, we had measurable detectable residues. Some of those amounts were in the fail category. You know, those boards would have suffered some form of electrochemical migration event. And that was with, because the peak temperature was lowered by 4%. Now I understand that's all relative. It was 4% of 250. Now I don't know if running a ultra low paste at 150 would yield good results, and it would have to be off by 4% to yield bad results. But I do know that heat is our friend and our enemy. Heat is our friend in terms of burning out the bad actors in the volatiles and activators and things like that in the flux. It's also our enemy because if you cook it too much, you can polymerize the flux, make it more difficult to clean. So there's this fine balance. But clearly, reflow temperature is key if you're not going to clean the board. It's much more tolerant if your concern is not contamination. You can be off by 4%, and I don't think anyone would tell you your intermetallic bonds are compromised, right? Mm-hmm. I think you still have a good solder joint at 4% off, but clearly from a contamination standpoint, it's a concern. So what's your experience with lowering reflow temperatures and still providing the proper heat to activate the flux and to burn off the volatiles and the bad actors?
Yeah. And it's a good point. What I would say is that the answer is always in the chemistry design. You cannot take a SAC reflow designed chemistry and use it with a low temperature alloy in a low temperature reflow process because of the exact reason you noted. You will have electrochemical issues because the activator packages are designed for higher temperatures, and therefore they're not effectively burning off and create challenges with electromigration. So when we develop next generation low temperature chemistries, we put a specific emphasis on designing for electrochemical reliability. So the chemistry design is completely different than what you would see in a traditional SAC 305 chemistry package. And actually, interestingly, we have a paper that we're going to be presenting at SMTAI later this year specifically on this subject for low temperature solder. So I think it'll be it's interesting timing for that question for sure.
I'll make a point to come and see that. I'll be there as well. So several years ago, I was hired as a court-approved expert witness. We had a contract manufacturer and an OEM tied up in litigation, and it was about contamination. And this particular company built a product that was going to be put into the ground throughout various locations in North America. And the part would be operated by a battery and not connected to an exterior power source. And it would send a radio signal to a nearby receiver. And because it was going into the ground, they wanted to protect it from the evils of the harsh environment around it. So they potted it, right? And they could have hermetically sealed it. It doesn't really matter. The point is it was potted. It was protected from the outside world. And then they had corrosion and conductive anodic filamentation, CAF, and they had surface dendritic growth. They had all sorts of contamination-related issues. And they couldn't figure out what went wrong. Well, we know what went wrong. But their logic was, as long as they protect this assembly from things outside coming in, they'll be safe. And what they didn't realize is they basically created this sarcophagus where all the sins of the process could not get out. And their board probably would have been better off. It probably ultimately would have failed for another reason, but they would have been better off, at least temporarily, had they not sealed it, because then at least they could allow natural outgassing of the moisture. And moisture was the catalyst here. You can get by with ionic residue. You might get other things, but you can get by with ionic residue. But without moisture, it doesn't form that catalyst to form ECM. They did not allow moisture to outgas. They trapped everything in there, and because they had a poor cleaning process, that was enough to start the whole chain of events. So if someone is not going to clean and they're going to hermetically seal or pot their board, are there materials that they should lean toward that might be better than others for that environment? Yep.
Yeah. The answer to that is absolutely, right? Especially if you're going to go use a no clean process. I would say take it from the perspective of, let's say, the mobile space, where we run into this challenge with electrochemical reliability, particularly on low to no standoff components. And you actually have exactly what you said, which is you get this trapped flux residue underneath that package. And in a hermetically sealed environment, what tends to happen is not only do you not create an avenue for those volatiles to escape, but you do have built up moisture inside, which adds to the potential for electrochemical reliability. So we developed a chemistry OM372 that was specifically for applications such as this, where you have you require ultra high electrochemical reliability in a covered component atmosphere, which sounds very similar to the example you explained, which was under litigation, where on a much more smaller scale, our situation, which is focused on the needs of a component or a product design, yours was on a grander scale of an entire device, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Well, it's good. It's good to know. They should have known that. They could have saved a lot of money had they known that before. When it comes to traditional solder paste printing, traditional meaning stencil, there are hundreds, maybe thousands, but certainly hundreds of different brands and types, varieties of solder paste to choose from. One can fine-tune their needs pretty finely. When it comes to dispensing, like jet printing, for example, the choices are much more limited. So do you see more of the industry moving toward dispensing solder pastes? I know there are limitations in speed and throughput, things like that. But with North America kind of known more for variety than quantity, do you see the adoption of jet printing technology or dispensing technology gaining even more traction? And if so, there are definitely limitations on the varieties of solder paste that can squeeze through a dispensing nozzle. So will that increase if that market increases as well?
Yeah. It's definitely becoming a factor. Certainly from the standpoint of finer feature sizes, where you don't have the luxury of being able to use your traditional squeegee printing process. So I would break it up into two I would say two distinct subsegments, if you will. You have your traditional air displacement, which is probably less reliant on chemistry design and more reliant on finding the right viscosity of the chemistry that you're using for that application. And then alternatively, you go to the piezo side, such as jetting technology, where you specifically need to design chemistries that are capable of withstanding shear forces that traditional squeegee printing doesn't see. So your chemistry platform that you're building off of needs to be completely altered for a jetting application. And I think that's part of the challenge in that space where you have micro dispense and jetting type applications, and certainly something that we've put a lot of resources into and supporting.
So say you have a solder paste brand called, Gnarly 101. Gnarly 101 sold for traditional paste applications. Can Gnarly 101 also be used in a dispense, or does it Gnarly 101 have to be 102? Do you have to physically change something to make it work with the dispenser, or are certain already available pastes just automatically compatible with dispensing?
I would say in a traditional air type displacement dispense mechanism, you can probably use Gnarly 101. But in a piezo application such as jetting, you would need to use an alternative chemistry.
Right, it has to be formulated for that particular purpose.
It has to be, yeah.
Okay.
The design has to be built for the application, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. It's long been said by many, I'm sure you've heard this before, and maybe even take exception to it, but people say this, that pretty much all reliability issues start at the printer. I don't know if that's true, but that's the process people like to blame. Whether it's true or not, what mistakes are assemblers making in the printing process or in the solder paste selection? So that whole genesis of the soldering application, what mistakes are they making that would lead to common failures that you see in the field, and how can they avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would almost argue that it actually starts even before that, from the surface finish of the component and the board that you are going to be soldering, right? So one of the major benefits that we have is we work closely with our MacDermid Alpha circuitry team to understand that interaction and that interface where solder meets the surface finish, right? And understanding that intermetallic formation is really where a lot of reliability, tends to start. Then alternatively, you have from the printing process, you're absolutely right. Targeting specific solder volumes, the ability of the chemistry to fill the aperture, the consistency and repeatability of solder volume are all incredibly important factors that generate a good intermetallic and a good resulting fillet, which leads to reliability in your end application post reflow.
Let's get in a car, get on your roadmap, and head toward the future. What does the future hold in terms of soldering materials, in your opinion? Where are we going?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is I think you'll see more and more, let's say, niche type alloys for specific applications. I think 10 years ago, it was kind of foreign to introduce a new alloy beyond SAC 305. And now suddenly, in order to meet the demands of the electronics world for more and more complex assemblies, you are starting to see the wide adoption of alloys that are outside the traditional baseline alloy because they can't either achieve the reliability requirements, they can't achieve the they can't mitigate the product design challenges with larger package sizes. There's the need for, like we said, lower temperature, higher operating temperature environments. So I think you'll see more and more acceptance of non-traditional alloys certainly in the high rel space. And I think there's also a massive movement towards greener technology, which is using the right alloying elements that are safe for the environment. And I think organizations are really accepting that and requiring it in many instances for their end applications. So the movement towards more greener technology, more environmentally friendly, combination of alloying, technology being accepted and more broadly adopted, and always, the industry is going to push us and guide us based on their end application or their market segment. So we have to think of things differently. The needs for automotive are not the needs for mobile, which are not the need for computing, and we have to approach each one of those segments differently. And I think the industry is always keeping us moving to that next level.
And that there'll be no end to that. There'll always be a next level with this business. That time has proven that over the many, many decades. We've been building circuit boards, right? So it's I think there's no secret that whatever is common today will be yesterday's news tomorrow. Quite literally. So, Paul, I really appreciate you being here today. Thanks so much for your insight and for your knowledge and wisdom when it comes to soldering materials. Thanks for educating me, and thanks for educating my audience. I'll put Paul's information in the show notes. So I'm sure, Paul, you wouldn't mind if people reached out to you?
Of course. Yeah.
Put you on the spot. I mean, it's hard to say no now, right?
Yeah, you can say no now.
Don't call me. So we'll put Paul's information on the show notes. So if you're listening on your phone, in your car, on the treadmill, wherever, you can go to the show notes part of it, wherever you get your podcasts from. They'll have show notes there, and you'll be able to get Paul's information. In the meantime, I would like to again thank Paul for being my guest today. It's been very informative, and I'll see you in Minneapolis in November, right, at SMT-AI.
In a few short weeks, yeah.
A few short weeks, yes. Let's hope that happens. I'm jonesing for a real show. I'm jonesing to see someone other than a bunch of pixels on the other side. So
I agree. Yeah. Well, I thank you for having me, Mike. I appreciate this. This is a very, like we talked about, is this very interesting endeavor that you have here with this podcast, and I'm glad we can support it in a small way.
Yeah, in a big way. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Paul.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for listening or watching the Reliability Matters podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and so many more. Also, be sure to check out my other podcasts, including the Concept to Creation podcast, where I feature conversations with entrepreneurs within the electronic assembly space, and the Innovations in Technology podcast, where we discuss innovative products within our industry. All three shows are also available in video format. Check out the Reliability Matters or Concept to Creation or Innovations in Technology podcasts on YouTube. Just search the show's name and you can find all three shows. Or go to MikeConrad.com. That's Conrad with a K. All three shows also appear there. Again, thanks for being part of my podcast family. I appreciate you being here. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay happy. And of course, keep doing it right. See you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Reliability Matters podcast. Join us on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month for new episodes of Reliability Matters.